So the next one I just wanted to go through is the key operational issues in implementing a whistleblower program, and we'll run through these. The first thing to note is that I've said whistleblower by design because I think it's the first principle of the Australian privacy principles actually refers to privacy by design and says you must take a whole of business approach to this. You can't just have a policy and hope for the best. So it's very similar with whistleblower, that every school needs to design the program for their own requirements, okay? And whether you are caught by this or not, whether you're caught by the Corporations Act or not caught by the Corporations Act. So you're going to have to make decisions about whistleblower coverage. Are you extending this to students? Are you extending it to more broadly to key stakeholders? Are you using internal or external whistleblowers services that I've talked about? And one of the things that so we have basically drafted our program in two ways, one for organisations that aren't companies and one for organisations that are companies. And what you see very clearly there is if you're not caught by the Corporations Act, you still offer these protections to whistleblowers. So you offer protections about not victimising them, making sure that they're not adversely affected through internal administrative decisions, providing protection and support. So you provide those. The Corporations Act builds upon those, if you like, okay? So really, you've got to make sure that as a school, it fits what you need to do, okay? The next critical thing from an operation perspective is you've got to make a decision as to whether you're going to use an internal, just do everything internally, or whether or not you're going to use some sort of external whistleblower service, or you're going to use a combination of both of those. And, we've seen all of those, internal only, external only, combination of the two coming through. So the two decisions that you have to make here is your whistleblower protection officers. Are you actually getting an outside party to act as the whistleblower protection officer? So they're the, an external service is going to actually take that initial disclosure. And the second one is, do you use internal or external investigators? Now, the size, nature and complexity of your organisation is absolutely key here. And the best way I can describe this is if you're working in a bank, for example, and you've got 100,000 people, that bank can have an internal professional integrity unit, and that can be very independent and employees in the company can feel safe to actually go to that unit. If you are a very small school, that doesn't work very well, does it? Because if you say blow the whistle to the principal and to the chair of the board and everyone knows each other, it doesn't really work. So the smaller that you are, interestingly enough, the greater the argument that you should use an external whistleblower service. The advantage of using one is that when it comes to anonymity, personally, I would be a lot more willing to say, provide my identity to an external provider, knowing that that external provider, that their brief is not that no one in the organisation would ever know my name. Their job is to play the go-between between me as a whistleblower and the organisation. And that allows you to properly carry out investigations. Because if someone comes in and they say, look, I was sexually harassed by someone at work, but I'm not going to tell you who I am. It's nearly impossible in that circumstance to do anything about it, right? Because how can you make an investigation if you actually don't know those circumstances? The second thing that I would say, and this is really under anonymity and investigation risk, the other thing that I would say is actually the expertise of a whistleblower, how important it is that the whistleblower protection officer, when you're actually receiving a whistleblower disclosure, you really need to know what you're doing. And you could get these are serious incidents. And quite often the people making those calls will be quite distressed or they'll be very nervous. So the person taking the call, their job is to really work to protect the whistleblower, settle them down, explain the circumstance, but they also need to understand criminal and the law, because they need to understand, for example, in certain states, I think in New South Wales, Northern Territory and Victoria, there's very broad requirements for any person who is has knowledge of a child abuse incident to actually make a report to the police, right? So the people receiving those really need to know what they're doing. So big question for everyone, internal or external, combination of both. So who are these external providers and what do they do? Well, generally what the external providers, just go onto Google and type in external, or just type in whistleblower services, and you'll see a whole lot come up there. They fall into some broad categories, if you like, from my perspective. There's the specialised whistleblower services. These are organisations, they don't do anything else, and they're there, and they've been around for quite a long time, and they are there to provide a specialised whistleblower service. You then have nearly every single one, I think, of the big four accounting firms providing whistleblowing services. And also, if I go further to that, I'm seeing a lot of medium-sized accounting firms starting to do so. A lot of law firms are starting to provide whistleblowing services as well. So there, I think we have internally about 20 or 25 that we've identified that are actually actively providing whistleblowing services. So what do? What they actually do is, think of them as your external whistleblower protection officer. So they're the person whose job it is to protect the whistleblower and walk them through the whistleblower process. So to protect their anonymity if they've requested it, but also to explain the whole process and go back to them with respect to questions to clarify issues on investigations. So how much do these whistleblower services cost? Well, of course, I don't know exactly, but I put that in simply to explain that there's a very logical thing here. The cost of providing any service is related to how often you use the service. So I think most providers will price their services based on the size of your organisation and the likelihood that they will receive disclosures. So in many cases, they might say, look, it's unlikely you're even going to get a disclosure during the year, and it might be quite low, but if you've got 30,000 employees, it's going to be a different a set of circumstances. The really important thing from my mind, think a little bit like an insurance policy. The stronger your internal governance systems, the less likely it is that you're going to have to blow the whistle, right? Or you're going to have the whistle blown, because people are going to go through those internal channels. So you should be able to demonstrate to service providers that, in fact, you have a strong governance infrastructure and that it's actually structured so only the serious complaints go. So you're not paying for what I'll call false disclosures or disclosures that don't qualify under your own policy. If we come to whistleblower service and investigation service, just one thing, be really clear, they need to be independent. You will see a lot of these whistleblower services, they have related investigation services, which is fine, but the actual process, you can't have the whistleblower protection officer, the person taking the phone call, can't be the person doing the investigation for obvious reasons, so they need to be independent. So you need to, and that's where I'm coming down to this question of due diligence. Certainly if you're going to appoint an external provider, you need to be very clear on what they are actually doing, what services they're doing. The most important thing to me would be who's answering the phone. I don't want to go to a service that has, you know, third-year law students answering the phone that aren't trained. I want to make sure that I'm going to an organisation that has the people that are answering the phone are highly experienced and can deal with the range of matters that are likely to come from schools, i.e. most critically, you know, if you've been dealing with banking and finance, you're never going to have had a child protection issue come through, but it is likely in schools that the external providers will get child protection related disclosures, and you need to make sure that your provider has people that are trained to deal with those. Obviously, other issues are, you know, how often, you know, is it a 24 by 7, 365-day a year type of service? And there's a whole lot of other questions you'd ask, but I just wanted to highlight that. So as we go through on key roles and responsibilities, these are sort of the key roles and responsibilities. They can change, the names can change, but you need to very clearly articulate the role of the board. We touched on that before when we said that they need to really approve the program, and also the key whistleblower protection officers, the people that are actually authorised to receive disclosures. They can be internal or external. Whistleblower investigators are really, really key, because you're going to have a range of investigators investigating different things based on the type of disclosure that's been made. In a school, I would have thought you also need to have a role which I'll broadly call a whistleblower program manager, or that person could also be, is likely also to be a whistleblower protection officer. But that person's role is to make sure the whole program is working properly, it's up to date, it's being maintained, people are being trained properly. So all the normal sort of governance aspects, you need someone just like in charge of privacy, in charge of child protection, so on and so forth. You need somebody in your organisation that is a whistleblower program manager. So then you've got to come to this question of how far are you going to extend the blow the whistle, if you like, and who can blow the whistle. So you've seen under the Corporations Act on the left-hand side, these guys can blow the whistle under the Corporations Act. The real question is, it's not designed for schools, but to do this properly, you really should be extending it across to parents, allowing them to actually raise issues, because they will often see things that should be raised, and things that don't necessarily fall under complaints or any other structure. So they might want to make those types of disclosures. And I've raised the other issues. Why I've raised this here is who you decide can blow the whistle has a direct effect on how you're going to build your program. Because when you're looking at all your internal people, it's very easy. You can have a policy published on your intranet, but nothing on your public facing website. So the law doesn't say what you have to do here. There's no law that says you have to put your whistleblower policy on the public website. So as you design your program, you've really got to start thinking about, look, if we want parents to get this, how do we do that? Now, obviously, the whistleblower program will be one thing on the public website that is clear, but you've got to let them know that it's there, and that quite often will be communications through newsletters and other ways. You might have briefings for parents and students and so on and so forth as you go through. So this is where I was talking about the design issue, that you really need to design it carefully. And then just to re-emphasize this point, and this is the diagram we had earlier, which is, your school's here and the whistleblower's going, well, how do I actually report things up? What are my internal reporting channels? Well, think about these. They're numerous within a school. Complaints. Okay, do I go through the complaint system? Is it something about your service? Do I go through a child protection notification? So we all have child protection policies on our websites, and they have notification processes through there. Human resources, you've got a double barrel in your human resources program. Well, even triple. Often there's things like, suggestion boxes and things like that. The most important, probably the internal grievance procedure. So you want to make sure that your whistleblowers have the opportunity to raise grievances through that process, rather than going through the whistleblower system. And of course, you also have discrimination, harassment, bullying type issues that come within that program as well. That you want to make sure that there's clear communication channels and notification channels before you get to the whistleblower program. Workplace health and safety obviously has the same sort of thing. If you see there's a risk or a danger, you need internal reporting mechanisms. Privacy, when you see privacy breaches, data breaches, all of those things you've got internal systems for. And then you've got a sort of the specialised things around boarding or overseas students. But a lot of organisations have fraud and corruption control programs in place as well. And within those, you have a notification process on who to go and talk to if you see that happen. All of those, if you're a whistleblower, the more choices that you have, the clearer it is for you, the better trained you are as to where to go, you're more likely to go up into that school. So instead of, your question mark disappears, if you like, and you go, actually, I know what to do here. And that stops the whistle being blown to the protection officer. You're taking the heat out of the whistleblower program, which is really important for two reasons. One is if you are under the Corporations Act, if it goes through the whistleblower program and qualifies as a qualifying disclosure, you are liable for all those protections. You have to keep those protections. You're liable for all those offences and possible civil penalties that arise. So you want to make sure that you're avoiding that process as you go through. So yeah, the stronger your actual internal processes. The other thing is that they will also have a direct reflection or relationship with the potential cost if you use an external whistleblower program. Because just as you go to an insurer and say, actually, I'm much more unlikely to have an incident occur because I've got great governance systems, you could have the same argument with an external whistleblower provider and say, actually, I know we're this size, but we've got really good internal systems. So the likelihood is you're only going to get, you might average, X number of whistleblowers per 100 staff or whatever for organisations generally, but we have really good systems, so we're going to be less. And it may be an argument for you to reduce the costs in relation to using an external whistleblower provider. Just right at the end of this management and board reporting, I just wanted to highlight this as a separate issue. You need to have very clear internal processes about individual disclosures. Why you need that is it must be on a need-to-know basis, and you've got to be very, very careful about who gets that information. So you don't just go, hey, the whistle was blown, let's tell the board. You're not going to do that. Each individual disclosure needs to be dealt with on its own merits. If it relates to the principal, obviously, you just don't tell people for the sake of telling them. You need to manage the disclosure first. Then what you need to do is think about how you're going to report up to the board. Now, some of those individual disclosures, it might come up to the chair of the board who actually decides that the board needs to know, or it may not go to the board. But generally, the board's got to get, broader reporting as to the whistleblower program and its performance. And that's where I've made the reference to zero reporting. The best reporting you could ever have as a board member is that you've got a really robust whistleblower protection program in place, and you get zero reports, which means every month or every quarter, whatever your cycle, you get a report that says we have had no whistleblower disclosures under our whistleblower program. And that would be music to the ears of most board members, because if they set this thing up properly, that's a pretty good radar to say that everything is working in your school. The very last part of the program, it's only just a couple of slides. We often refer to the school governance puzzle, and it, quite often is completely overwhelming. There's so many things that you have to do as a school to make sure all of this comes together. Just from our personal experience, there's a sort of sliding scale to this, if you like. Most schools, in the first instance, will focus on those really high-risk areas. So the risk and compliance programs themselves are obviously core infrastructure for governance, but they're going to focus on child protection, workplace safety, student duty of care, getting rego right before they generally put in a whistleblower program. Could you imagine putting in a whistleblower program if you didn't have a child protection program or you didn't have a workplace health and safety program? That would be a major worry, because probably the first whistle would be blown is that you don't have those things in place by people that know what you're actually doing. So you've got to build your governance structure up to make sure that the whistleblower program is working effectively and giving you the best outcome. In our experience, once you've got that first governance block in, you then look at the second block. That is how your board's working, the boardroom online type programs that allow very clear reporting and transparency at the board level, putting in your human resources program with internal grievance, EEO, those types of issues, and the other specialised modules. All of those are highlighting your internal processes for managing incidents, which will avoid things going through whistleblower. Probably the third level is around fraud and corruption. We all know that fraud and corruption works in schools, but again, you tend to be focusing on other things like human resources and complaints before you go down that line. Now, really, the benefit of a fraud and corruption program really goes hand in hand with a whistleblower program. the program that we've designed internally, the most important part of it, and there is actually an Australian standard for this, the most important part of it is you're actually training your staff as to the fact you have an internal fraud and corruption program and what falls under that. So, you know, taking a pen home isn't going to fall under it, but taking a box of pens home or you know, taking large amounts of stationery and things really is theft, and that comes potentially under that, all the way to the much more complex type fraud situations that you have in schools. And you know, from our discussions with schools, they happen a lot more than are publicised. Generally, they're just not publicised. The great thing about fraud and corruption is the whistleblower program just works in with it beautifully, because people tend to blow the whistle on fraud and corruption, which is probably where a lot of this started in the first place. And just now to the last slide. You know, what's your risk profile on all of this? Well, it will very much depend on your structure. School groups will have a very different risk profile from individual schools. At one end of it, if you fall under the Corporations Act, you are going to have compliance risk, because obviously if you don't comply, you've got serious risk around that. So look, really from my perspective, just throwing up a whistleblower policy on your website and not doing all the rest of the work is an extremely risky thing to do, because you're likely to get caught. At the other end of the spectrum, if you are not caught by the Corporations Act, you don't need to do whistleblower by law, but you're missing a great opportunity to close the loop in your governance program. And in the middle, it's all about the risk associated with your existing internal governance programs. I was talking to a client this morning, and we were just talking about it, how over the last 5 years, school governance has just changed completely. 5 years ago, you could be non-compliant with most things. You can't be non-compliant. Everything's changed. Registration cycles have changed. You know, expectations of child protection have changed. And this is just the next thing. So really, there's been a maturing of governance, and interestingly, this whistleblower law, as it's come in, really raises the bar yet another level for schools. So I hope that was useful information for everyone in relation to it. I know it's a lot to take in. It's a pretty complex area. I'm sure you've got lots of questions. So can we do it this way? If you, on the chat feature of the software we're using for the webinar, just send in any questions that you have. If you don't, if you log out of this and think of a question, send it through. If you're a client, send it through to your client relationship manager. What we're going to do is collate all of those questions, and then we will send everyone a sort of frequently asked questions response. So we respond to everyone with respect to all of the questions. We'll also send you a link to a page on our website which just describes our whistleblower program, fraud and corruption, all the related modules like human resources and so on and so forth, that all are key to the ongoing management of your governance program and compliance with whistleblower legislation. And lastly, of course, if you are a client again, just feel free to contact your client relationship manager. If you are not a client, just come through the Contact Us section on our website, and we'll get one of our guys to give you a call on that. So thanks very much, everyone, for joining us. And that's the end.